Then I let out a hoarse, strange, yet far-reaching cry. It was answered by a shout. Barclay heard it, and it brought out all that was inside him. He threw Darling's body aside. Before Barclay could even jump for his gun, I aimed mine at him and warned him not to move. I had the upper hand, and he knew it. With 2 shots left, I could easily take him out. But I gave him one chance to surrender. I pleaded with him to think of his daughter and offered him a deal. I had all the evidence against him, and he was cornered. But if he surrendered, I would spare his life and let him go back to his old country. It was for his daughter's sake. Barclay stood there, calculating his chances. He was a brave man, and I respected him for it. I could see him measuring the distance to his gun, determined to make a move. I knew I had to act fast before it was too late. I called out to him again, urging him to surrender. I told him that I had killed his accomplices and that he was alone. I could see Morton and his men coming to my aid. I gave Barclay an ultimatum: surrender or face death. Barclay asked what would happen if he refused. I told him that I would kill him right then and there. He knew I was serious. I urged him to be a man and surrender for his daughter's sake. Finally, Barclay gave in. He walked to the chair and sat down just as Morton and his men arrived. I ordered them to put away their guns and told them that the game was up. Barclay was my prisoner, and I gave him my word that he would be protected. Your job is to draft the necessary documents with him. He's willing to split his entire estate, every inch of land, every livestock, as per your and Zimmer's instructions. He's relinquishing everything. Once the process is complete, he'll be allowed to leave the country, and he must never come back. Chapter 14. Barclay stared at the bloody stain on my chest, causing my thoughts to race. Morton rushed up the stairs, his face etched with concern. When he saw me, he stopped in his tracks and opened his arms wide. "The girls are coming!" Barclay exclaimed suddenly. "Morton, help me get Darling inside. They can't see him." I faced the porch, watching as Miss Barclay and Gwen approached, clearly worried. Foster was probably still at camp. I wondered what they would say and do when they arrived. Suddenly, Barclay and Johnson came to carry me inside. They laid me on the couch in the parlor where the girls used to spend time. "Tim, you're in bad shape," said Barclay, leaning over me and placing his hands on my chest. The room was filled with sunlight, but it seemed to be fading. "I reckon I am," I replied. "I'm sorry. If only you had told me sooner, Darling. Damn him. He's always been a problem for me." "But the last time, Barclay." "Yes, and I almost drove you to kill me, too. Tim, you talked me out of it for Diane's sake. She'll be here any minute. This will be harder than facing a gun." "It's hard now, but it'll be okay." "Tim, can you do me a favor?" he asked, looking embarrassed. "Of course." "Let Diane and Gwen think Darling shot you. He's dead now. It doesn't matter. And you're hurt. The girls care about you. If you don't make it, the old side of my life will return. It's been creeping back." "It'll be here any minute now, just as she enters this room. And damn, I'd switch places with you if I could," Barclay said. "I'm glad you said that, Barclay," I replied. "Darling got me, but it's our little secret. I had my reasons, not that it matters much now." The light was fading, and I struggled to talk. I felt numb, like I was encased in ice, with occasional prickles of sensation and rushing sounds in my ears. But my mind was clear. There wasn't much to be done. Morton came in, looked at me, and left. I heard the girls' light footsteps on the porch and murmuring voices. "Where did I get hit?" I whispered. "3 places. Arm, shoulder, and a bad one in the chest. It hit your lung, I'm afraid. But if you leave now, you might have a chance," Barclay replied. "Sure, I've got a chance." "Tim, I'll tell the girls, do what I can for you, then take care of Morton and get out of here," Barclay said. Just then Diane and Gwen entered the room. I heard 2 low cries, so different in tone, and saw 2 dim white faces. Gwen rushed to my side and dropped to her knees. Both of her hands went to my face, then to my chest. She lifted them, shaking. They were red. White and silent, she stared from them to me. But some woman's intuition kept her from fainting. "Papa!" Diane cried, wringing her hands. "Don't lose your nerve," Barclay replied. "Both of you will need it. Tim is badly hurt. There's little hope for him." Gwen moaned and dropped her face against me, holding me tightly. I tried to reach out and touch her, but I couldn't move. I felt her hair against my face. Diane let out a low, heartbreaking cry, which Barclay and I understood. "Let me tell you what happened quickly," Barclay said hoarsely. "There was a fight. Tim killed Snecker and Darling. They resisted arrest. If it was Darling, it was his gun that took Tim down." Tim released me. He didn't just let me go, he saved me, Diane. I have to divide my property and return what I've stolen. I have to leave Texas immediately and never come back. If you ever want to come home, you'll find me in old Louisiana." As she stood there, realizing she was saved, her eyes shifted from her father to me. My own eyes clouded, and I thought if I were dying then, it was not in vain. "Send for Foster," I whispered. They worked over me silently and quickly. I was sensitive to touch and sound, but I couldn't see anything. Eventually everything was quiet, and I drifted into a black void. Suddenly heavy footsteps jarred into the blackness, and I opened my eyes to see Gwen's haggard face, Miss Barkley flying to the door, and the stalwart ranger entering. Life rushed back into me with agonizing pain in every nerve. I saw him start and heard him cry, but I couldn't speak. He bent over me, and I tried to smile. He stood there silently, his hand on me, while Diane Barkley told him what had happened. She finished the story with her head on his shoulder, tears falling for me. For the first time I saw him stunned. When he recovered, he didn't think of Diane or the end of Barkley's power. He turned to me. "There's no way this bullet hole can take down a ranger like me," the man exclaimed with a powerful voice. "Don't lose hope just yet." I couldn't respond, but I managed to crack a smile. Unlike the faces of Gwen and Diane, his was free of pain and despair. He fought death with the same vigor he fought evil, and his presence alone lifted the spirits of the girls. Diane began to believe in a positive outcome, while Gwen's sorrow dissipated. The room was transformed by his aura, a force as big, strong, and virile as himself. His mere presence made me want to live, and suddenly I felt alive. It was like a jolt of electricity running through me, reawakening every deadened nerve. I went from being numb to feeling pain, and that pain soon turned into a fever. My mind drifted in and out of consciousness, with Gwen's ghostly figure appearing and disappearing, and Diane taking care of me during my lucid moments. But the ranger was always there, sometimes appearing in my dreams as a protector, warding off dark and ominous figures. The fever eventually broke, and as I sipped on my first nourishing drink, I found my voice. "Hey there, old man," I whispered to Foster. "Can't believe you double-crossed me like that." His good-natured rebuke let me know that death was the furthest thing from his mind when it came to me. He knew what he was doing. He even laughed at me. I had to do it. Gwen sat down on the bed and took my hand. "Tim, you must forget it. It was inevitable. You were defending yourself. You had to do it. Don't let it ruin your life." I looked at her, and in that moment all my brooding and despair vanished. Her words were like a balm to my soul, and I felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. I realized then that I had been foolish to let my mind dwell on negative thoughts, and that I needed to focus on healing and moving forward. Gwen's presence was like a ray of sunshine in my dark world, and I knew that with her by my side I could overcome anything. "I ain't got no excuse," I said. "Hush now, tell me. If you had confronted them and drew on them, then you had a chance to kill my uncle?" Diane asked. "Yes, I could have done it easily," I replied. "Why didn't you then?" she asked. "It was for Diane's sake. I'm afraid I didn't think of you. I had put you out of my mind," I explained. "Well, if a man can be noble at the same time he's terrible, you've been, Tim. I don't know how I feel. I'm sick and I can't think. I see, though, what you saved Diane and Foster. Why, she's touching happiness again, fearfully yet really. Think of that. God only knows what you did for Foster. If I judged it by his suffering as you lay there about to die, it would be beyond words to tell." "But, Tim, you're pale and shaky now. Hush, no more talk," Diane said. I watched Diane closely, wondering if she would shrink away from me. She was gentle as she smoothed my pillow and moved my head, but there was a dark abstraction hanging over her that was foreign to her nature. It was a moment where my sensitivities were on high alert. However, I saw and felt and knew that she did not shrink from me. My thoughts and feelings escaped me for a while, and I dozed off. When I woke up, Foster and Diane had just come in. As Foster bent over me, I looked up into his keen gray eyes, and there was no mask on my own as I looked up to him. "Son, the thing that was needed was a change of nurses," he said gently. "I intend to make up some sleep now and leave you in better care." From that hour I improved. I slept, I lay quietly awake, I ate nourishing food. I listened and watched, and all the time I gained. I didn't say much, and even though I tried to lighten the mood when Foster was around, I wasn't very successful. Time passed, and Gwen was almost always with me, but never alone. She wasn't as cheerful as she used to be, and it broke my heart. I prayed for her to recover, to hear the old joy back in her voice. But Gwen had been through a traumatic experience that left a deep scar on her soul, almost as dangerous as the wound I had received. I still held on to hope, though. I had seen other women recover from similar situations and become their old selves again. However, as I observed her more closely, I realized that time alone wouldn't be enough for Gwen to heal. She was afraid of everything, always on edge and terrified of the dark. It was then that I realized one of the reasons for her strange behavior. The house where I had killed one of her relatives would always haunt her. She had told me that she was a Southerner and that blood was thicker than water. It was clear that she couldn't stay in that house any longer. I sat up in bed, startling all my kind nurses. "Foster, I won't recover in this house. I need to go home. When can we leave?" They tried to persuade me to stay and scolded me for insisting on leaving, but when they saw the determination in my eyes, they finally agreed to plan for our departure in a few days, provided that I improved. We would ride out of Pecos County together back along the stage trail to civilization. The look in Gwen's eyes confirmed my decision. I could have left that very day and endured any pain or discomfort. It was strange to witness the response of Foster and Diane to my idea, to the promise of what lay beyond the wild and barren hills. Foster recounted to me that very day about the headlong flight of every lawless character out of Linrock, the very hour that Snecker, Darling, and Barkley were known to have fallen. Foster expressed deep feeling, almost mortification, that the credit of that final coup had gone to him instead of me. His denial and explanation had been only a few soundless words in the face of a grateful and clamorous populace that tried to reward him, to make him the mayor of Linrock. Barkley had made restitution in every case where he had personally gained at the loss of a farmer or rancher, and the accumulation of years went far toward returning to Linrock what it had lost in a material way. When he boarded the stage for Sanderson to leave Texas forever, he had been a poor man. Not long afterward, I heard Foster talking to Miss Barkley in a deep and agitated voice. "You must rise above this. When I come upon you alone, I see the shadow, the pain in your face. How wonderfully this thing has turned out when it might have ruined you. I expected it to ruin you. Who but that wild boy in there could have saved us all? Diane, you have had cause for sorrow, but your father is alive and will live it down. Perhaps back there in Louisiana the dishonor will never be known. Pecos County is far from your old home, and even in San Antonio and Austin a man's evil repute means little. Then the line between a rustler and a rancher is hard to draw in these wild border days. Rustling is stealing cattle, and I once heard a well-known rancher say that all rich cattlemen had done a little stealing. Your father drifted out here, and like a good many others, he succeeded. Judging him by the laws and morals of a civilized country might not be worth the effort. He somehow ended up with the wrong crowd, and it's possible that an honest deal tied his hands and led him astray. The matter of land, water, and a few head of stock had to be decided outside the court, and he probably didn't realize where he was heading. However, one thing led to another, and he found himself in the midst of crooked dealings. To protect himself, he bound men to him, and that's how the gang developed. Many powerful gangs have developed that way out here. He couldn't control them, and he became involved with them. Eventually, their dealings became deliberately dishonest, and that meant that blood would be spilled sooner or later. He became the leader because he was the strongest, but he could have been worse. When he stopped talking, I felt the same impulse that must have motivated Foster to show Barkley in a better light than he was painted, to give him the benefit of the doubt, and to judge him justly in the eyes of rangers who knew what wild border life was like. "Foster, bring Diane in," I called. "I have something to tell her." They came quickly, probably concerned about my tone. "I've been hoping for a chance to tell you something, Miss Barkley. That day I came here, your father was quarreling with Darling. I had heard them do that before. He hated Darling. The reason came out just before we had the fight. It was my plan to surprise them. I did. I told them you went out to meet Foster, that you two were in love with each other. Darling grew wild. He swore no one would ever have you. Then Barkley said he'd rather have you as Foster's wife than Darling's. I'll never forget that scene. Before you arrived in Linrock, there was a lot of history behind it all. Your father mentioned that he had supported Darling, but the deal had ruined him and turned him into a rustler. He claimed that he was finished with it all. I understand everything now, and I want to clarify things for you, Miss Barkley. It was actually Darling who ruined your father. He was the one who was rustling, and he caused the gang to form. However, Darling didn't have the intelligence or ability to lead the gang, so your father became the leader because they were related by blood. Your father was never a true criminal at heart. I respected him because he proved himself to be a man in the end. He faced me to be shot, but I couldn't do it. Foster mentioned that you have a reason to be sad, but you need to move on and not dwell on it. In my opinion, you haven't been disgraced or dishonored. However, the important thing is whether or not a woman like you who values honor has a real and lasting reason to feel ashamed. Foster and I both agree that you don't. Then Miss Barkley came and sat beside me with tears in her eyes, and Gwen entered the room to see her cousin kissing me gratefully with sisterly affection. It was a woman's kiss, given purely out of gratitude. Gwen couldn't understand it. It was too sudden and unexpected. Despite the dark stain between us, I could tell from the way her face turned red that she still loved me. Chapter 15. 4 mornings after, we found ourselves on board the stagecoach, making our way down the main street, departing from Linrock. The entire town had gathered to say their goodbyes. The raucous cheering and fervor of the crowd was getting on my nerves. I just couldn't see things from their perspective. I was feeling pretty morose, and the whole world seemed to hinge on one thing. Morton was stubborn about sending an escort with us to Del Rio. The escort was made up of 6 cowboys, mounted and carrying light packs, and they rode ahead of the stage. Luckily, we had the stagecoach all to ourselves. A comfortable bed had been fashioned for me by laying boards across the seats and furnishing it with blankets and pillows. My 3 companions managed to squeeze in as well, but Foster made it clear that he would be spending most of the ride outside. Miss Barkley didn't seem too thrilled about the prospect of being stuck inside with me either. It meant that I would be alone with Gwen. The thought excited and saddened me at the same time. How different this ride was from our first one, which had been full of adventure and promise. "It's over," exclaimed Foster, sounding relieved. "It's done. I'm glad for their sakes and ours. We're finally out of town." I was too preoccupied to notice the shouts and cheers of the crowd, but I did notice a subtle change in Gwen Langdon's expression. We hadn't even traveled a mile before the tension in her face melted away and her downcast eyelids lifted. I could see a lighter spirit in her, without a doubt. That's when I allowed myself to relax. I had been so tense trying to hold myself together for this journey. I lay back with my eyes closed, feeling exhausted, in more pain than I wanted to admit. And I thought and thought. Miss Barkley had said to me, "Tim, it'll all work out. I can tell you something now that you never knew." Gwen had a soft spot for our cousin Reuben Darling for years. She hadn't seen him since she was a child, but she remembered him. Gwen Langdon was left without any family after her brother Arthur was killed in the rebellion. Reuben and I were her closest relatives, and she had been looking forward to meeting Reuben out west. However, Reuben disappointed her by being a heavy drinker, which she hated. Despite this, she could never fully hate him because he reminded her of Arthur. When Reuben was killed, Gwen was shocked and haunted by it. I stayed with her on those nights, and Vaughn and I have since been studying and talking about her. We believe she is gradually recovering, but she still loves me just as she loved Arthur. I was told to not brood and be patient, but what did I know about women? I couldn't be sure if I had killed Gwen's love for me or if she still loved me but couldn't break down the barrier between us. Our journey began with physical distress, but I eventually grew accustomed to the role of the stagecoach. We stopped in the small town of Barkley, where Foster got letters from reliable ranchers to verify his ranger report for Captain Neal. To ensure Governor Smith had all the necessary evidence, Foster took the precaution of leaving a blank line in his report, omitting the name of the mysterious leader of the Pecos gang. This news was shared as Foster returned to us and entered the stage with a gray flame in his eyes. He spoke of his report, claiming it to be the longest and best he had ever turned in, but he had no intention of allowing Tim to read it due to his peevishness towards Foster's desire to put his part on record. Foster went on to explain that many had suspected but few had known the identity of the supposed leader, and he had taken measures to ensure their silence. With the death of Jack Blome and his associates, Linrock was now free and safe, with its future in the hands of determined and capable men. We all sat in silence, with Diane's face showing a mix of sorrow and joy. It was clear she was overwhelmed by the news. After a moment I dared to say that Vaughn Foster, Lone Star Ranger, had seen his last service. He confirmed this with emotion. Gwen, who had been quiet until now, turned to us with a strange look and said, "In that case, then, if I am not mistaken, there were 2 Lone Star Rangers, and both have seen their last service." Her lips trembled, and it was impossible to tell if she was about to laugh or cry. This was the first hint of her old combative spirit or archness, which stirred a wave of feeling in me that was too much to handle in my weakened condition. My head was spinning, and my body was racked with sudden shooting pains. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to focus on the happiness I felt despite the suffering. The sound of something beating echoed in my ears, pulsing with the same rapid rhythm as my own blood. Not too late, not too late. From that moment on, the ride was different. I improved with each passing moment, leaving Sanderson, the long gray barren between Sanderson and the Rio Grande, and Del Rio behind us. After 2 days in Del Rio, where I was able to sit up, we headed towards the eastward trail to Uvalde. We were the only passengers on the stagecoach from Del Rio to Uvalde, which was probably arranged by Foster, who had become an individual with whom traveling under the curious gaze of strangers would have been embarrassing. He was most desperately in love with Diane, who had renewed her bloom and gained what she had lost during the long, tedious miles we had ridden together. She, too, was desperately in love, though she occasionally remembered her identity and that she was in the company of a badly shot-up young man and a broken-hearted cousin. Most of the time, Diane and Foster rode on top of the stagecoach. When they did ride inside, their conduct was sweet to watch, yet it ignited fires of jealous rage and longing in me. It also seemed to have a remarkable effect on Gwen, who had been in a strange and somber mood since we started the journey. However, she gradually began to brighten and change more and more, perhaps divining something about Diane and Foster that escaped me. All of a sudden, she was transformed. "Look here, if you people want a spoon, please get out on top," she said, surprising us all. If that wasn't the old Gwen Langdon, I didn't know who it was. Miss Barkley tried to appear offended, and Foster tried to look insulted, but they both failed. The couple before me was undeniably happy. Despite the circumstances that could have made them serious and contemplative, they exuded youth and love. They were like magnets and steel, or powder and spark. I half expected them to embrace right then and there, but instead they settled for clasping hands. It was a moment that would stay with me forever. 2 people standing together on a ridge, embodying everything that was beautiful, passionate, and tragic. And I couldn't help but feel responsible for their happiness. I had been their undoing, but in the end I was their salvation. It was a truth that I held close to my heart. After Gwen's comment, Diane and Foster eventually made their way to the top of the stage. "Tim," Gwen whispered, "I think they're up to something. I heard a few words. I bet they're going to get married in San Antonio." "It's about time," I replied. "But shouldn't they have told us?" "Gwen, they've forgotten we exist." "I'm just happy they're happy," Gwen said, and there was a long silence. I was lying down, and Gwen took my hand without saying anything. My heart raced, but I didn't want to break the spell by opening my eyes or speaking. Eventually, Gwen spoke up. "Tim, I have to tell you something." She hesitated, and I kept my eyes closed. "Have I been very sad?" she asked. "You've been sad and strange, Gwen. It's worse than my bullet wounds," I replied. She gripped my hand, and I felt her hair on my forehead and her breath on my cheek. "Tim, I swore I'd hate you if you—" "I know," I interrupted. "Let's not talk about it." "But I don't hate you," she said. "I love you," I said, desperation creeping into my voice, "and I can't give you up." "But Gwen, can you move on? Can you forget?" I asked, hoping against hope. "Yes," she replied. "That terrible feeling has faded with every mile we've traveled. Little by little, mile after mile, it's gone. But I have to be honest with you, Tim. You never had any sense." At her words, my heart sank, but then she opened her arms and we were reunited. It was a moment of pure joy, so overwhelming that it left me numb. "Yes, Gwen," I said. "No man has ever had such a wonderful girl." "Tim, I never took off your ring," she whispered. "But you hid your hand from my sight," I replied quickly. "Oh, Tim, we're as crazy as the lunatics outside. Let's think a little," she said. I was happy to have no thoughts at all, just to feel her close to me. But then she asked, "Tim, will you give up the ranger service for me?" "Indeed I will," I replied without hesitation. And leave Texas, never to return until the day of guns and rangers and bad men and even breaks is past? She asked. Yes, I said firmly. Will you come with me to my old home? It was beautiful once, Tim, before it was let run to rack and ruin. 1,000 acres, an old stone house, great mossy oaks, a lake and river. There are bear, deer, panther, wild boars in the breaks. You can hunt and ride. I have horses, Tim, such horses. They could run these scrubby broncos off their legs. Will you come? She asked. I rather think I will, I said, excitement building in my chest. But dearest, after I'm well again, I must work. I've got to have a job. You're indeed a poor cowboy out of a job. Remember your deceit. Oh, Tim. Well, you'll have work, never fear, she said with a laugh. Gwen, is this old home of yours near the one Diane speaks of so much? I asked. Indeed it is, she replied. My land has been well maintained, while hers has been neglected. We'll have to work on fixing that, I said. Agreed, she replied. But there are formalities we need to take care of first. I looked at her, noticing a soft flush on her cheeks. What do you mean? We need to make a formal agreement, she explained. But before we do that, can you try to bring back the Gwen Langdon who used to torment me? The one who broke promises and leaned from his saddle? Kiss me, Gwen. As we neared Uvalde, Gwen and I sat together, watching the sun set behind distant mountains. We were leaving the wild and barren border behind, and the memories of its haunting faces and wild life were slowly fading away. Other rangers, with less to lose, would continue the work until the border was safe. The great state of Texas had a destiny to fulfill, and one day the role of the rangers in that destiny would be written in history. The end. This concludes Brand of Outlaws, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.